What we have for today is the weekly update for our raid meta situation. We have just looked at the weekly update for Mythic Plus, so it's time to look at the other side of the PvE features of this game right before the release of patch 10.2.5. Also worth reminding in this video as well that even if 10.2.5 is launching, there is no real balance tuning to be had about specs and classes in the raid, so nothing really is going to change based on any tuning coming in just a few days. Now, before looking at this, which is Mythic, let's have a laugh and look at Heroic. Not necessarily to laugh at Heroic players, just to look at the drastic differences you often see in performances based on bosses, mostly based on how fast bosses die, how quickly the fights are over. In Heroic, drastically changing the value of some specs. In here, you can see wild things like Enhancement Shaman, Assassination Rogue, Devastation Evoker, all in the top performers of the raid, and then as you switch to Mythic, Devastation is nowhere near the top, Assassination is also nowhere near the top. We also completely lose Balanced Druid, who drops all the way down in the bottom half for this situation right here in Mythic. Now here we have the comparison from a couple of weeks ago. This was week 6, now we are in week 8, so this is what it looks like right now compared to a couple of weeks ago. You do see some wild things, of course, things like randomly Devastation Evoker being second for a week. You also had Assassination doing much better than it is now. Out of nowhere you had Affliction, which we were pointing out, growing a lot in performance, now going much lower down than before. We have another week, so we have another campaign, another propaganda campaign to warn players from trusting too much these type of overall damage, all bosses results, because they are not often or very often telling you the truth about the performance of some specs. From one week to the next, certain specs might be dropping completely from the radar based on the new bosses being killed by guilds. Because of course, in case you don't know, we are still in the middle of progress for the last couple of bosses for many guilds. Most guilds actually in Mythic haven't killed these bosses, which means every week that goes by we get more and more new kills of Tindral, so you get to see weird stuff like Devastation being either the worst one of the bunch or the best one after demo, so every week might be a complete toss-up on how well they are performing. And then of course even more random results on Ferak. At the moment, Frostmage somehow and Windwalker even being some of the best specs, which might skew the overall, results in the overall numbers. So you always have to take these type of overall results with a grain of salt if you're trying to look at how each and every one of these specs is performing. Like for example, right now, this week, Marksmanship, which continues to be one of the better results with also one of the largest swings in performance, one of the more volatile performers. Even if you look at the parses, specs with very few parses are also very unreliable because you don't have nearly as much confirmation of their performance, like in this case Marksmanship being played 25 times less, 30 times less than Beast Mastery is. So you can trust way more Beast Mastery being here, being a top 6-7-ish spec, than Marksmanship being over here when it comes to the raid. Maybe you can find something when looking at the performance going back the entire tier, if you can look at some kind of change in graphs over here, but again they might also be bound to some insane jumps up and down. You can immediately tell, for example, right here, Arms Warrior being towards the bottom and then having a massive drop only to then rise a little bit more. Something similar happening over here for Survival, suddenly believing himself to be a middle of the pack spec and then realizing they are terrible and going back down with the rest of the specs at the bottom of the bunch. And it can also help to show the consistent performers, like in this case Demo, which has had a pretty straightforward line towards the better performers, even at their worst. At their worst, which was the beginning of the season, they were still the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They were still the 6th best spec overall. So that shows you they have had a continued positive trend overall, which is funny. It is funny because once more, going from season 2 and the rework, the Blizzard intent of moving demo away from their mega burst profile had tons of demo warlocks crying, calling about how the spec was being butchered and how the spec was also very weak. Turns out, what a surprise, demo has actually been the most powerful of the specs of this tier in the raid. Yes, we can always put the asterisk when going to look at the rankings of the performances, that if we look at the demo lock performances in particular, you can see that they still are one of the targets for PI, but nowhere near as bad as before. Nowadays, PI is not given nearly as often to a demo lock like you would say, for example, a Beast Mastery Hunter, where you can see here BM is very often one of the primary recipients of PI right now. So even after the whole change of playstyle around their cooldowns, they have continued to be a very powerful spec even in Season 3, which continues now after the changes to many of the specs that we have looked at in how much they were going to improve after the buffs. It's been now almost a month, right? Surely now we have enough of a window to be able to see what were the effects to the changes of many of these specs. The specs being buffed were all three of the mage specs. Destro, Windwalker, Red Paladin, Shadow Priest were all buffed specs together with Devastation Evoker. The only couple of nerfs went the way of Havoc and the way of Assassination. In terms of effects, we haven't really felt these effects on Havoc Demon Hunter. We have felt them a little bit more on Assassination. Not because of the less damage they are doing, but because more top level rogues are not playing Assassination anymore. They are playing Outlaw or Subtlety, so the results of Assassination are now suddenly worse because fewer high quality players are playing the spec. Similar to Mythic Plus, where many mages went over to Fire, and now Fire is a top level spec in Mythic Plus. Now we're getting the same treatment when it comes to Arcane in the raid, in terms of power level, in terms of meta level in the raid as a DPS spec. We also, worth mentioning as we go from DPSing to healing a little bit, that we also had some buffs and some nerfs when it comes to healers. So one of the things we wanted to see was a smaller gap from the best to the worst healer. Best healer throughout this season has been Mistweaver Monk, at the very least in terms of sheer numbers. We're not talking about, power of their cooldowns or anything of the sort, just about sheer numbers. They were the best, and in terms of sheer numbers, Holy Priest was the worst. Even after Mistweaver Monk being nerfed about 3 times now, and Holy Priest also being buffed a couple of times as well, they haven't actually moved positions. Mistweaver is still the most healer out of all healers in the raid, and Holy Priest is still the weakest one. At the very least now the gap is shorter. At the very least now Holy Priest is much closer to other specs. As you can see, they are only a couple thousand from Holy Paladin and Resto Druid. They are even technically slightly ahead of Preservation Evoker. So the gap is not nearly as big as it was before. You can see the effect now in the healing logs as well. The average healing being in and around a 10% gap from the last one to the first one. So 10% is somewhat acceptable when it comes to the power level of the different healers right now. Now, I was also talking about how over time Holy Priest would have overtaken Discipline as the tier goes deeper and deeper. We are not there yet. We are only at this point about 300 parses away from Holy Priest passing Discipline, which at this point I am quite safely willing to bet is going to happen next reset. In our next weekly recap of the raid, we will see Holy Priest right over here beating Discipline. Now, as a bit of an off-topic complaint, I would like to see Holy Paladin changed even further. It is sickening to see a spec being considered average, middle of the pack, and just overall uninspiring, if anything, filled with problems after the rework due to their playstyle still being so ridiculously popular purely because of their auras being given to the class. So essentially you are forced to take up one spot out of 4, 25% of the entire roster of healers taken up just by one Holy Paladin because of this aura problem. That feels kind of sad, especially to the healers in here who don't bring anything of the sort, like a Resto Shaman, who is not needed for anything, a Preservation Evoker, who is not needed for anything, a Resto Druid, if Balance or Feral are meta, is not gonna be needed for anything, which definitely get punished by this advantage that Holy Paladin has. You do, of course, can see these type of advantages when it comes to DPS players as well, but they're not nearly as hard to fill, not nearly as hard to mix and match what you need, because you only have 4 healers versus, 14 DPS specs. Yes, some get their advantages here as well. Of course, there would have been no reason to bring a warrior in the raid. You should have just brought another Havoc Demon Hunter, another Rogue. Perhaps if you are more ranged heavy, you should have brought another Demolock or maybe another BM Hunter. The only reason you get to bring a warrior is because of Battle Shout, maybe even because of Rallying Cry. That's an easy advantage warriors have, similar to the advantage of a Paladin, but it does sting a little bit more for a healer, given the smaller amount of spots available. What is also interesting is to take a snapshot at how the situation is right now, especially for some of the harder bosses, especially for Tindral, who is about to be butchered in 10.2.5. There is the mega nerf coming Tindral's way in just a few days, which means the results we are seeing here for Tindral are about to become way more reliable, because these parses, these very few parses we see for Tindral, are about to become way more. So we get to see if and how many of these things are just temporary and others are going to become much higher or much lower based on the higher amount of parses. If you look at even here, Tindral has very small entries for many specs, so you don't quite know exactly how the situation is for these specs. For the ones more popular, you can be rather safe in knowing they are powerful, like Demolock, like Arcane, like Havoc. But when you scroll down over here, what about the 1 parse for Affliction and Destro, currently being in the top half? What about the 15 parses for Devastation Evoker, putting them at the second best spec on this fight with massively random results from the worst one to the best ones? So this is what we will be able to see with the balance tuning going the way of Tindral in just a few days. That will be perhaps the biggest shakeup in terms of the performance of the specs in the raid. You might also have, for example, way more guilds now willing to go back and stop extending, because the thought of having to re-kill Tindral is giving them PTSD. So with the mega nerf, we will get more and more logs of all of the previous bosses as well, because more guilds are gonna go back re-killing them. There will also be more room for underplayed specs, of course, because now when you start re-killing stuff, for example, more rogues might be willing to go back playing assassination, more BM hunters might be willing to go back playing marksmanship, for example. More Fury Warriors might be playing more arms, more Unholy players might be playing more Frost, etc, etc. So that's also the part of the season where the more niche, the more hipster, the more underplayed, maybe even underrated specs might be given more room to play, compared to the first part of the season where way more guilds are just focused on progressing and trying to play the more effective spec. Now, in this second part of the season, you might have more room, more window for everyone to enjoy the raid. Maybe we get to discover some surprises in terms of performances when it comes to the specs in the raid. But this is what we have for this week in terms of the performance. So far, more or less in line with what we have already seen, which was the growth of performance of Arcane Mage, as well as the growth of performance of the 2 other spec not named Assassination. When it comes to Rogue, we have already outed a couple of specs being high for just a week or so in the overall meters as frauds, and they have continued to unmask themselves, like for example Devastation right now padding super hard on the roots on Tindral is not really actually an overall super powerful spec. Same goes for Affliction, for example. We have seen a more consistent growth for Fury though. Fury is now approaching top 10 level in the raid with better results over time. It seems to be more relevant in their growth. It's also worth mentioning at the moment Fury is the highest one of the legendary gang. At the moment, the legendary gang is not having a good time because everyone else is in the absolute dumpster when it comes to using the two-handed legendary, with the exception of Fury, who is actually doing okay right now. That's the only other unique thing when it comes to the performances of the specs in this week. Week 8 in this second month, in this end of the second month of Season 3, when it comes to the raid performance. So, for this Sunday, it's time to leave each other on this recap of the raid. Let me guys know, of course, what have been your experiences so far in the raid with whichever you have been playing. So, with this out of the way, it's time to leave each other. We are starting the goodbyes by thanking all of the Patreon supporters for the contribution and the help to the growth of the channel, which can, as usual, still be given completely for free. You can like and comment down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, no, but for real, I have like an alarm ready when I release the video to make sure I pop by the comments and participate for once.